Okay, we are live. Joining me today is a very special guest, Michael Silberstein. Michael, for those who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I teach at a private liberal arts school called Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, and I teach at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I often say that I'm an eclectic freak, too much so for my own good in academia. So I'm interested in, and I've written about the foundations of physics, quantum mechanics, and relativity, also consciousness and emergence, and how all those things are connected with one another.
Very cool. So that's very exciting. Do you have a background in physics, or is this something that you're only interested in the philosophy of?
In grad school, I took a lot of physics courses in preparation to do foundations.
Okay, that's very awesome. And I know your recent book, Beyond the Dynamical Universe, was actually, you have a copy handy.
You're surprised, right?
No. So that was co-written with a mathematician and a physicist.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was wondering how that project came about. Like, how did you get you guys just had common interests, or how did you hook up with the physicist and the mathematician?
Well, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? A philosopher, a physicist, a mathematician walk into a bar. So the physicist I've been working with for years, we've published together in foundations journals like Foundations of Physics, and philosophy journals, and in physics journals. So I was just very lucky to find someone that was a physicist who was interested in foundations. And obviously, I could never do a lot of the work that I do without this other person, because I could never replicate that education. And the mathematician isn't so much interested in foundations, but is amazing at Mathematica. So can check us.
Yeah, and that's one of the really cool things about this book, is that there's a lot of actual math in it. I mean, you have it separated in those threads, the main thread, and then the philosophy of physics thread, and then the foundational physics thread. And in there, you have the whole mathematical formalism for each section, which is really, I think, a new kind of approach in this area. So I think that's really cool.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We were trying to make it as, to create as many paths through the book as possible for people with different interests, and not let the math get in the way. I don't know if it works, but that was the idea.
Yeah, I think it did.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the view. You guys have a very, I guess, you would say a grand plan. You want to solve like most of the problems that are out there currently, using your relational block world approach, coupled with a neutral monism. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the motivation behind it, what sort of problems you're trying to tackle, and how you think, just generally, before we get into the details.
Sure. So we know that there are many attempts to relate the physical world, physics and biology, to consciousness, for example, something you and I are both interested in. And of course, and especially now, right? We know there are people who are trying to directly connect physics or some information theoretics driven sort of account to consciousness. Whether or not that's hubris is an open question, but that's what a lot of people, and these things come around. These are fashions, right? Whether it's quantum mechanics or IIT or whatever. So, but then here's the point. So when you're playing this game, obviously it depends on what physics and your interpretation of the physics that you're trying to connect up with consciousness. So to make a long story short, we became convinced for reasons, standard reasons from relativity, and other reasons from quantum mechanics, such as delayed choice, we became convinced that it's a block universe. And from there, one can ask the question, does this change the way we think about how consciousness relates to the universe? Does it change the way we think about a lot of these sorts of standard problems, even in physics? Like, the problem of, how to explain the Big Bang, or the second law, or interpreting quantum mechanics, or closed time-like curves, or what have you. Because it seemed to us that while there are a lot of people out there that allege to be block worlders, it almost never makes a real difference to anything else that they think. And we thought, well, if that's true, then it's not a very interesting question. And maybe it does make a difference. And so that's where we started. And so we started thinking about, from that perspective, if it's really a block universe and you really can give yourself the future boundary condition, maybe now we can think differently about how to interpret quantum or closed time-like curves or how consciousness relates to matter. So that was the idea.
Yeah, that's very cool, and I think that's an interesting point that you just made. That if you're going to endorse the block universe, but it doesn't change anything else, if everything else remains the same, then it's kind of it's not an exciting or interesting point that's being made.
Right.
Nothing really hangs on it.
Absolutely.
So can you but you guys have a I guess I'd say a non-standard interpretation of the block world or block universe. So can you tell me, how do you guys interpret what is the block universe in your, specifically the relational block world formulation?
Right. So typically when people endorse the block universe, they say, look, it's exactly like a classical universe, only past, present, and future exist. So, and of course we agree, we adopt that. But the relational part is where we bring in considerations from quantum mechanics and considerations about trying to unify quantum mechanics and relativity. And so the idea is, I'm trying to say this without getting into the formalism or getting too technical, but the idea is that the universe, it shares something a little bit with ontological structural realism. I'll talk about the differences in a second. But the idea that the universe is not composed of things, there are no, there's no primitive thisness, there's no intrinsic properties, at least when it comes to these sorts of physical systems. So for us, imagine a quantum setup from initiation to termination, twin slit, whatever you like. So typically when you look at interpretations of quantum mechanics, there is some quantum system, whether it's a wave or a particle or a field, whatever the ontology, there's something running through this classical setup that explains what's going on. But for us, it's not like that. For us, you can't separate, you can't reduce. This is not unlike what people like, Healy say. You can't reduce the classical to the quantum. The setup is part of the quote unquote quantum system. And so in that sense, not unlike it's somewhat stronger than what you might infer from Cauchy-Specker, but it's the similar kind of idea that you can't talk about what the quantum is separately from the experimental setup, and not just at a particular time slice, but in the 4D setup from initiation to termination. So if you give yourself the future boundary condition, what we do is tell a story. We do it formally in gory detail, but we tell a story where you can talk about the outcomes using an adynamical global constraint. So in physics, we're all familiar with things like the Lagrangian or least action principles or path integrals. So that's the idea. But unlike the retrocausal accounts of quantum mechanics, like Price and Wharton sometimes invoke, instead of imagining some backwardly causal process, which for us makes no sense, because once you give yourself the future, why in the world would you think that the universe must run on some sort of causal or dynamical process? We say, no, we can use the future boundary condition, create an adynamical global constraint, not unlike they do with least action principles, and then predict outcomes in that way. So I hope that conveys some of the spirit.
Yeah, so the relational part is that what we call individuals are only contextually individual. They have to be sort of derived from the whole system as it were, in and of itself.
Absolutely. And we talk about it some in the book, but not at length. So it's part of a larger picture that I call ontological emergence or contextual emergence, ontological contextual emergence. We have a manuscript. I have a manuscript with some other people, Robert Bishop and Mark Pexton, who was at Durham, that's under review about this now. So where we talk about a lot more than just quantum mechanics. But the idea is that contextuality and relations are fundamental. Or if you prefer, in the parlance of analytic metaphysics, those dispositional accounts where the dispositions truly are not intrinsic. So there's a lot of different ways to try to say this, but the idea is that the universe really isn't, atomism is just false. And that's something that we infer from quantum mechanics and quantum gravity and relativity. So from the very beginning, the universe is not built up out of things with any kind of primitive distance and intrinsic properties. So in that sense, I'm totally on board with the way, say, panpsychists characterize the physical.
So there's a lot in there. So I mean, so one thing is that there's an argument from special relativity to the block world, and I think that argument is kind of well known. You do say in the book that it's not forced on you.
Certainly not. No, of course not.
There are kind of ins, outs for presentists of various sorts of that nature. Do you agree with that?
Of course, yeah.
So the argument from special relativity suggests the block world, but doesn't commit you to it.
Certainly doesn't entail it. No,
it doesn't entail it. So then, but you just find it you think that's the best fit.
I think that, I mean, we talk about it in gory detail in, chapters 2 and 3, both special and general relativity. I think that it's strongly, if you're a realist, let me put it this way. If one is a realist about Minkowski spacetime, if one is a realist about Einstein's equations and general relativity, then I think you have a powerful argument for the block universe. So we make that case, which, as you say, many people have made before, and then we try to plug all the loopholes and respond. This part of it is just, you might say, analytic metaphysics with some physics thrown in. But then we say, look, but forget about this, right? The real reason to believe in block universe is, additionally, what can it do with regard to other problems?
Right.
And that's what the rest of the book is about.
Right. So, and I want to get to those other problems, but the thing you said just a second ago was that there's some about the delayed choice setup, which you think also suggests the block world, block universe. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Sure, and a lot of people have said this as well. So, and again, I want to say suggests, not entails, but because we know that, in a delayed choice experiment, it very much seems like, what happens in the future affects the past. So, and you can imagine in a delayed choice experiment, you can imagine a human being, making decisions about whether or not to, say, block the holes in a twin slit experiment and trying to confound quantum mechanics. But there's absolutely no reason to believe that, and we perform delayed choice experiments. I mean, not with people in the role that I said, but there's no reason to believe that quantum mechanics, that the probabilities of quantum mechanics would ever be confounded in that way.
Right. And they do it with computer programs now. They're even better.
Absolutely. And there are, like Hardy, for example, has been talking about an experiment that I think they're going to perform, where they're going to try and literally see if they're going to use satellites. I'll spare you the details because it's a long story, but maybe you've seen it. They're going to actually see if they can get people's actions to violate the probabilities of quantum mechanics. But most of us would predict no.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I predict no. And so I mean, I'm wondering if I'm just clear on the structure of the argument. So the argument is, if the block universe exists and all times are equally real, then there's no need to posit a backwards kind of causation. There's just this kind of adynamical constraint, which makes it the case that the thing which happens later is lining up with the thing that happened earlier. Or I'm just wondering how. So I'm not exactly 100% clear on how the block universe gets us out of backwards causation, except for the fact that there's no causation in the way
the block universe by itself doesn't necessarily get us out of backward causation. So there's several steps here. The first one is, if you give yourself future boundary conditions, all of the block universe, then immediately you can start telling a story where you don't have to be a realist about the wave function, because there's just one world and you already have your outcomes. Now, that's step one. So in other words, to put it in the terminology relating to the Bell result, you're giving up the independence assumption of the Bell result, right? So what motivated people like Hugh Price and Ken Wharton in the beginning was, we're always being told that, there's no way you can have a hidden variable theory that's local, right? That's something that's trotted out as a mantra about Bell. But they said, well, wait a minute. What if you give yourself future boundary conditions? And now you can imagine, right, a causal process that threads the light cone, as it were, instead of being space-like separated. And now, there's tons, there's a cottage industry around this. Kramer, there's tons of it, right?
Yeah.
So, but what we said was, well, look, wait a minute. You've already got the future, right? Maybe it's time to start thinking, outside the box when it comes to dynamical or causal thinking. So maybe instead of it being some backwardly causal process, which immediately gets weird in relativity anyway, right? Because, what's the ordering from what frame of reference? And why believe once you have the future that there must be, what does backwards causation even mean when the future is already real, right? And okay, so then we started thinking, well, maybe there's another way to think about this. And I want to be clear. I think both Wharton and Price are, even though sometimes they speak dynamically, they often do agree that what we're really talking about here is an adynamical kind of constraint, and that causation talk, as Hugh makes very clear in this view, causation talk is going to be perspectival. So I don't want to contrast ourselves too much with them. So the other thing then we tell this story using the sort of formalism that one uses with least action principles, right? To tell a story in terms of adynamical global constraints, which we do in physics all the time. Right. We say things like takes all the paths at once or whatever. And most people, when they look at path integrals or whatever, they just say, oh, that's a mathematical trick. It's very clever, but it's not really mapping onto the way the world is. How nice. But we're saying it's not just a mathematical trick. And you don't have to really take this talk about all paths at once seriously. You can talk about an adynamical global constraint. And the other component here is the following. We argue for a view that we call direct action, which has a long history in physics and was abandoned for reasons that aren't really relevant anymore. But the idea of direct action is that, imagine a quantum setup from initiation to termination. Whether you're talking about a particle or a field or a wave, we always imagine that there's some medium, right? A contiguous medium that connects the initiation to the outcome. But we argue that's false. There's no reason to think that there has to be anything in between, so to speak. So, the thing, whatever you want to call it, is an initiation, and then it's an outcome. So that's what direct action means. It's an idea that Feynman, I think, was one of the first people to try to work out.
Interesting.
So now we don't have any things, right, moving backwardly or even forwardly. There is no quantum system that is thing-like.
Right. So, I mean, this gets us back to, I guess, these waters are so murky with respect to the interpretations, because I know that Bell's theorem is interpreted in different ways. The way I've always interpreted it was as ruling out a kind of realist interpretation, not the locality. So a lot of people want to take it as indicating something about locality. I don't think you can do that because of special relativity, basically, and relativity in general, which has to be local. So I don't, depending on what you mean by local, I don't see how you can have quantum mechanics be non-local in any sense of that term.
Well, this is, as you say, murky and troubled waters, but there are interpretations of quantum mechanics that aren't non-local, such as Bohm and GRW.
Right.
But precisely as you say, those interpretations have to, however you want to put it, reinterpret or reformalize relativity. They have to tell some sort of story about what constitutes a preferred frame.
Right.
But I think, again, if you, just as you suggest, I think if you take Minkowski space-time realistically, that's not going to work. And if when you say that Bell speaks against realism, if you mean by that quantum systems have definite intrinsic properties prior to measurement, which are faithfully measured by the system, or maybe just merely perturbed by measurement, then we agree with you. That's exactly part of what we mean when we invoke contextuality.
I see. Okay, good. Yeah. I wasn't sure about that, but all right. I'm glad that you said that. So, so that's a very interesting, because now we have this, I mean, we'll get back to this in a second, but in the block universe, as you defend it, you say nothing happens, nothing's moving.
From a God's eye point of view.
Right, from the God's eye. We'll get back to that anti point of view where we are currently.
Right.
But so I guess one of the criticisms I've read of this kind of view is why you suggest that nothing is moving. I mean, in this review of your book, in NDPR, which came out, the reviewer said, why it's astounding that they say nothing is moving in the block universe. Things are moving if they're at a place T, T1 at place A at T1 and at place B at T2. And it seems like you want to deny that. So I'm wondering if you could just respond to that. Well, why is it that you take that?
Well, the review would be a subject in itself, but I'll just drill down on the particular point that you raised. So I think it's really important to say, when we make those claims, and it's not just us, right? People like Einstein, Garrosh, lots of people have said these sorts of things. So you say to yourself, well, wait, what do you mean by that? Because we might as well unpack this lingo now. So we make this distinction between the God's eye and the ant's eye point of view in the book. And that distinction is not one, let me be clear, because some people have actually been confused by this. We're not invoking theism or God. It has nothing to do with religion. It's a distinction.
Or ants.
or ants. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So it's a distinction that Wilczek made, the Nobel Prize-winning quantum field theorist, where we open the book with this quote where he says he thinks that the new advances in physics are going to come from taking the block universe, Minkowski space-time, seriously, what he calls the God's eye point of view. So the idea is, when we say nothing is really happening or moving, we mean from the God's eye point of view. So again, this is just a thought experiment. Imagine yourself, whatever, in the fifth spatial dimension, or, imagine yourself, outside of space-time, whatever the hell that would mean, right? Or reference the film Interstellar, whatever you like, right? Imagine the super advanced people in Interstellar, or the Tralfamadorians, or whatever. If it was meaningful to have such a perspective, right? If it made any sense, if whatever it would mean, nothing would be happening. It would be like taking, I hate to use this analogy because nobody knows what film is anymore, but for those of you who still remember film, imagine you take the film and you just unreel it, and it's all just there. It would be like that. So it's only from within, from the ant's eye view, the view that you and I are having right now, as beings in the block universe, that things are happening. So of course I agree with people when they with all the block worlders when they say, well, look, a block worlder can say anything about change that a presentist can say. At time t, things had these properties. At time t+1, they had different properties. So I think we can all agree, if that's all you mean by change, sure. Then we're certainly not denying that.
Right. Okay. So you just want to, so what you're trying to kind of get across is that when you look at the block all together, there's nothing that literally changes. But if you adopt a notion of change that just, well, look at this section of the block compared to that section of the block, things are in different positions, so there's been a change.
Of course. Yeah, right. Of course. And
so that's a semantic, it sounds like a terminological point, really. Nothing important hangs on that.
Yeah, analytic philosophers like to, I know I shouldn't, we're going to get into that later, but they like to say stuff like, so often when a block worlder gives a talk, even if they're not just a normal block worlder, they'll say stuff like, well, look, everyone agrees the future is real, so, what do you mean? Or everyone, and then you're like, okay, but, maybe we can't discern the nature of reality, based on language.
Yeah.
So if you just imagine a picture of presentism versus growing block versus block world or whatever, come on, these are different worlds, right? So
yeah, ultimately they're different worlds. Okay, so yeah, that's good. So now, how do you put all this stuff to work? What you say that the real payoff is what we get from taking this seriously and adjusting, sort of putting the God's eye view to work. So how does it pay off?
Well, we've been talking about quantum, so I'll talk about that one first. And there's a lot of, as you say, we're the crazy people that try to solve every problem, which of course is a terrible tactical error, because anybody who does that is immediately interpreted as a nut. I totally get. I mean, I can appreciate that. But so in quantum mechanics, as I was saying, so what are the standard problems of quantum mechanics? You got the measurement problem, and then you got the problem of how are you going to explain EPR correlations? There's other problems in there, but we can just talk about those. So we can tell a story where you can be a psi epistemic, you can take a psi epistemic view, a realistic one. You don't have to take the wave function realistically. That's certainly a lot of people are in quantum information theory, and people like Healy who are adopting pragmatic accounts of quantum. This is a growing view about quantum, I would say, not to take the wave function seriously. But we don't want it to be merely epistemology, right? Or at least I don't. I want to say something about the world. So giving ourselves the future boundary conditions, giving ourselves least action, and these adynamical global constraints, we can tell a story in which there's only one world, there's no measurement problem, and what we call EPR correlations, which to some people look like literal non-local dynamical connections, are really just a function of some deeper adynamical global constraint. So that's quantum.
Which global constraint gives you the EPR correlation?
Well, we I'm trying to, this becomes technical very quickly. So in the book, we adopted a particular fundamental formalism in terms of
the Rafe graph theory.
Yeah, the reggae calculus.
Sorry,
yeah. And so to make a long story short, in the history of unification, people have been trying to work out sort of discretized accounts of relativity, right? So you can directly quantize. There's all kinds of tricks, and there's no point in going into it here. But one of the early ones, which people are still playing with, is reggae calculus, which is a kind of discretized general relativity. And likewise, there are analogs for quantum field theory. And to make a long story short, what you have is 4D discretized graphs. And in this sort of view, you can't really separate space-time from matter. So this is something that Ravelli talks about a lot in the context of loop quantum gravity, which is different but historically related to these earlier approaches. And the idea is that just as in general relativity, you can't separate space and time, and just as in general relativity, you have a background independent theory, right? Which we often put it this way, space-time tells matter how to move, and matter tells space-time how to bend, or whatever, right? So in an perhaps even more radical fashion, in these sorts of formalisms, when you talk about matter or whatever, you're talking about activity on this graph. So you can't separate matter from space-time. We call it space-time source. Source is a technical term from quantum field theory. So from that perspective, we can sort of answer the question that you're asking, but we can talk about here's the point. We can talk about global constraints that involve future boundary conditions on segments of the graph using these sorts of theories, which are already, it's a Lagrangian formalism.
Right.
They're already using least action principles of a sort. But I think more simply, so recently we just wrote on this question about superquantum, which again would take a long time to unpack. But one of the questions quantum information theory people are asking is, why aren't quantum correlations even stronger than they are? Why isn't it even weirder than Bell correlations? Is there an answer to that question? Which it is also a way of asking the question, why are Bell correlations the way that they are? So we recently wrote some stuff where we just invoked conservation to try to tell that story. So there may be an easier, kind of less, formally nasty kind of constraint in terms of conservation principles that would explain, and we all know that conservation principles are already adynamical global constraints. They're not dynamical, right? But in this case, we bend over backwards to point out that you have to take conservation statistically to involve the future as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm a little bit confused about, sorry, when you guys talk about the psi-epistemic interpretation, but it's still realist. So, I mean, I'm not as up on all of the different views as you are, and I'm kind of a flat-footed, I guess, Copenhagen type of guy who tends to think, it's all epistemic, really, and quantum mechanics doesn't tell us anything about the way the world ultimately is. It tells us about what kinds of things we'll find when we ask various questions. So that's that's something in common with the quantum Bayesianism and these kinds of things that are out there. Although I can't keep up with that. But I'm wondering, so apart from that aspect of it, what's the realist part of your view? What is it that's out there? That's the source thing you're talking about, the space-time source.
Well, so let me just say this. I think the best current explication of the view that you prefer is Healy's pragmatic account of quantum mechanics. And I think I have it on my desk right now. Healy has a book called The Quantum Revolution in Philosophy, if anybody's interested, and many, many articles. I think he does a really good job of arguing for the kind of account. Whether or not it's Copenhagen, as you know, there's so many versions. I don't know what to say, but
exactly.
So we certainly agree with him that the wave function is not some physical thing that collapses or whatever. But Healy's view ends up in just complete metaphysical quietism, right? He beautifully illustrates how quantum mechanics could be incredibly predictive, even though we can't say anything about what goes on between initiation and termination of an experiment. And I'm totally sympathetic to that.
Right.
But we go further and say, but look, there is a metaphysical account you can tell, right? If you take seriously, so this is the realist part, if you take seriously the idea that the world is four-dimensional, if you take seriously the idea that the future exists, and you take seriously the idea that the fundamental quote-unquote entities, and entities is a bad word here, right? For all kinds of obvious reasons, that all of this sort of graph theoretic formalism that I was trying to discuss, that's what's fundamental. So what's fundamental is four-dimensional, not some time-evolved 3D entity. So now you say, well, what is that? So we say when it comes to physics, what's fundamental are space-time source elements. And you say, what is that? And the only answer I can really give to you is to start talking to you in gory detail about how these discretized 4D graphs work and how the movements of what we call properties of particles and things, quote unquote, move around on these graphs. And then you might say, yeah, but what is that? And at that point, I admit, right, here's the problem. Because typically when we ask people for a realistic ontology, we have it in our head that what that means to be a realistic ontology is now you're going to invoke some kind of entity for me. You're going to tell me about particles. You're going to tell me about waves. You're going to tell me about fields, right?
Right.
Well, but what we're describing is none of those. And it's not dynamical. So
It's a double whammy.
It's a double whammy. Exactly.
But so I guess maybe I am too biased in this dynamical sense. I try to put myself into the frame of mind of the block worlder and take this stuff seriously. So I'm not trying to be dismissive or anything, but I guess I don't understand what's realistic about that. So is it just that is the realism part simply the claim that, well, let me try to put it this way. So from the point of view of quantum mechanics, a person who is sympathetic to kind of view, I would say, look, quantum mechanics itself doesn't tell us anything about what's really going on, just tells us about what observations we're going to see. And then you say, no, it does tell us what's really going on. What's really going on is, and then you point to the graph theory and you start talking about that. Is that where so is it the quantum mechanics that's telling us that, or is this just metaphysics and you're saying, look, it's compatible with the quantum mechanics?
Well,
that's where I'm confused.
Well, let me just start out stating the obvious, right? Nobody can make underdetermination go away, right? So, of course, nothing and no mathematical formalism, no empirical result entails any metaphysical view. Right. That we're just stuck with that, right? Now, given that, everyone has to make decisions about their approach. So my approach is what I call science first. So start with your best science, quantum, relativity, whatever it might be, and try to make inferences, right? Admittedly, inductive and perhaps often not strong, but also try to unify, right?
Right.
So one of my complaints about the game of interpretation and quantum mechanics, which by the way, I think is, I don't want to shit on it, because I think it's way better than, say, talking about grounding or whatever. Right? If we're gonna compare things, but is that they just stick to non-relativistic quantum mechanics, and then they just try to tell a story. Right. So to answer, which is, it's a start. But to answer your question, it's, is it just quantum? It's quantum and it's relativity, and it's how we might think of these things as unified that drives the sort of account that we're telling. So I think when you put quantum and relativity together, right? And we all know that there are these results in quantum mechanics, right? Even those of us that are not realists about the wave function, and I am sympathetic with your view about quantum in general, there are still these crazy results that we have to explain. There's this weirdness that we see in the lab and in the real world, right? And if you take that and you take that seriously with, Minkowski space-time realism, then that's what drives the sort of story that we're trying to tell. Right. It's a block universe, but it's not made of, things and stuff. But we can tell a story about how, statistically you can recover a world that looks a lot like that. It's not so different than if you look at loop quantum gravity, for example, right? Read Ravelli's. If you're not a philosopher of physics, you can read Ravelli's recent popular books. In loop quantum gravity, a lot of the things that I'm saying still obtain. You can't separate space-time from matter. There's no such thing as time, fundamentally. And you have to talk about how the stuff is, recovered in some regime or what have you. So I don't think we're saying anything that's super. In fact, I think it's less crazy because we just need space-time. We don't need, we don't need Planck scale, beyond Planck scale weirdness. We don't need loops. We don't need what have you.
Yeah. So I guess the background assumption then from what you're saying is that you still want science to tell us something. So I agree with the science first view. I'm all for that 100%. I kind of dabble in grounding more than I should, I think, but still I agree with what you said.
And I feel bad about saying it because I know I'm pissing people off that I like, but
well, maybe they should be pissed off. But anyway, the question, I guess, is really one of what the goal of science is. So is the goal of science to tell us about the fundamental structure of reality, or is the goal of science just to tell us about experimental outcomes? I think that's one of the most basic questions about what the goal of science is. And the way I guess I've been convinced that, you know, the goal of science is just to tell us about experimental outcomes.
So you've been convinced by von Frosten or somebody that
well, it's not. Yeah, I guess von Frosten is. I'm not really empiricism as a standpoint or something like that. I'm not a neo-realist.
okay.
I just think, you know, that science is not going to answer questions about the fundamental ontology of the world. It's going to answer questions about what we'll find when we look.
But you also just told me you are a science first person.
Yes.
So, I mean, so now obviously we're into the territory of value judgments, epistemic metaphysical value judgments. So I'll just tell you mine. I think that when it comes to trying to figure out the nature of physical reality, how it relates to consciousness or whatever, at least starting with science is our only hope. That's certainly better off than starting with pure armchair metaphysics.
Absolutely.
Right. So now if you're, and I believe me, I have lots of days where I am a total pessimist and a doubter. So if you're right about science, I don't know if you want to call it instrumentalism, I'll let you decide what you want to call it, but if you're right about science, then I would just say we're fucked, right? Right? Then you know,
fucked in the metaphysical sense.
I should go try to learn something else, right? I mean,
but it's only. I mean, it would only be that metaphysically. I mean, it would just be that science doesn't give you a metaphysics, but it certainly we're not. You know, we're still going to have computers, and we'll still be able to do GPS, and we'll still fly, and you know, all that stuff.
Sure, that's great, and that's awesome, and I enjoy all that. You know, modulo climate change, but you know, but I don't know how you feel about it, but here's how I feel about it. I only give a fuck about science because I hope it's going to tell me something about the world. I would much rather be reading literature, watching movies, you know, drinking, going to see people play music, right? That's just me. That's just my personality, right? If God came down and said, dude, science is, you know, you're not going to learn anything from that or whatever, right? Not that I don't believe in God. That's not the point. I would be like, okay, then I'm just going to go do art.
It's a wrap.
Okay. Yeah, I'm done. But I know that there are lots of people, and I think this is this meta question, you know, metaphysics, meta philosophy. Obviously, we're at a moment right now where nobody knows what we're doing. You know, what is naturalism? What is philosophy? Right. I think everyone's going a million different directions. Nobody's talking to each other. And I know there are a lot of people these days, whether it goes under the banner of pluralism or whatever, there's a lot of people these days who think that what it means to be a philosopher of science is just to go study some science, right? I'm being a dick about it. I'm being overly hyperbolic, but you get the idea.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
I don't give a shit about that. I wouldn't do that. That's not how I would spend my life. And then you have people on the other end who are doing, you know, armchair metaphysics, and they want to talk about supervenience, realization, and grounding. I wouldn't want to spend my life doing that because I don't see how that relates. You know, why in the world would you get it in your head that there's such a thing as metaphysical glue to begin with? I don't even have that intuition, right? Or the idea that science needs some extra scientific thing. So I don't even have that intuition. So the only thing somebody like myself can do is I want to know what the world is like. And if science isn't going to tell me, then I'm in the wrong business. Or at least if it isn't going to give me clues, I'm in the wrong business.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. So, well, I was going to ask about something else, but now I'm sort of stuck on what you were just saying. Well, yeah, let me go ahead and let's leave it at that, because I mean, there's a part of me that agrees with you, but I guess I just, there's a lot of leaping that you have to do to get from where I'm at to where you're at. So, I mean, it's not that I disagree 100%, but I am a little skeptical about that. So in the book, you guys say you're skeptical of string theory. And this does kind of connect to what you're saying just now, because it seems like a large part of, not a large part, but at least part of the kind of skepticism ultimately comes down to intuitions about the principle of sufficient reason. And it seems like you have those intuitions. And I'm wondering, first of all, do you think that's a fair characterization? And second of all, if so, why there do you have, so you don't have the intuitions elsewhere, but here principle of sufficient reason seems kind of important, but that's not really a science-based thing.
So certainly, yeah. I mean, I want to be very clear. So even though I've been, shitting on metaphysics, right? I want to be super clear that nobody can make any inferences without some metaphysical assumptions.
Right.
Right. So, and science is totally underdetermined, and so it's it's a bootstrap kind of situation, right? And your assumptions can always be wrong. So where the principle of sufficient reason comes in is, this is a point in the book. We start off sort of echoing a point that Lee Smolin, I think, is most famous for making, right? And his point is the following. Look, we know how the dynamical game, the differential equation game of physics is played. We start off with some initial and boundary conditions, right? So we're going to say, here's the system. We're going to carve this thing out as the system we're going to time evolve. We're going to cook up an equation, and then we're going to count everything else, right, is the boundary condition. And then we're just going to time evolve this sucker. And he says, okay, that's fine, great. But now what happens when we get to the Big Bang? Right? It's like, that game's not going to work, right? Or is it? Right? And so that's where the multiverse, and this is a giant, this is not just us, obviously. There's a giant debate, right? Conferences are held about all this stuff, so what do we say about the singularity? And there are various, I don't want to paint them all with the same brush, various flavors of the multiverse or whatever, right? But they say, oh, well, there are many Big Bangs or whatever. Maybe they base that on, inflation. Maybe they get it from string theory. If you take the landscape seriously or whatever, or some combination of those.
Right.
And so we say, but, wait, maybe doesn't there have to be bedrock somewhere? Like, is it turtles all the way down? How do you escape the problem of this just goes on infinitely, right? And that's where the principle of sufficient reason seems to put you. Now, for Leibniz, it's fine because he gave himself self-causing God or whatever.
Yeah, the ultimate out.
The ultimate out. But for those of us that are not comfortable with that, and so we say, well, maybe you should. I'll just, I'll give you an analogy. Think about like a crossword puzzle. Again, a crude analogy. Why are the letters placed where they are, right? Well, the answer is going to be, leaving aside the teleology of people writing it, right?
Right.
Set that aside. The answer is going to be because of where all the other letters are, right? Or because of these constraints in the form of clues, or however you want to put it, right? So what we say is, instead of, searching high and low for some deeper dynamical story behind the Big Bang, maybe we think about the entirety of space-time in terms of adynamical global constraints. So, yes, in relativity, you can choose to start with cosmic time with the Big Bang, and then you can make claims like the universe is 14 billion years old or whatever. But this is relativity. That's just one frame of reference, right? You could also start, quote unquote, in the middle, right? And then use the adynamical global constraints to explain the quote unquote beginning and the quote unquote end or whatever. So that's the idea.
Right. So that gets us to the whole discussion about the initial conditions. And I guess just in passing, I'd say I guess I'm more optimistic about string theory than you guys are, and I don't see the landscape or the multiverse as. I don't believe in the multiverse, but I think like 20% credence it could be right. But ultimately, you guys think, well, look, these things aren't empirically testable, so this is kind of dire straits for science if we're accepting things that are not empirically testable. if the multiverse turns out to be true, then everything is predicted, and that's not really like a legitimate position for scientific theory. I mean, that's a criticism that's made, I think, a lot of the multiverse, but that's one that you guys want to echo, right, or support.
Yeah. So let me try to put it like this. So in philosophy or metaphysics, we're always looking for legitimacy, right? And so some of us, hey, let's do science. Let's turn to science. Let's whatever. And then we turn to our best, our current fundamental physics. And whether it's from inflation or string theory or some combination, we have these people who want to say, look, all of our problems, why the singularity, why the initial condition, why the values of the constants, why these fundamental laws, blah, 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 blah. Oh, it's not a problem because it's a multiverse of one sort or another, right? So, of course, just invoke probability theory and give yourself infinite rolls of the dice, as it were. And now I can explain it.
Problem solved.
So we're done. And so what we want to say is, well, wait a minute. That's too easy, right? I mean, any theory that explains everything explains nothing. So if you're going to tell a story like that, again, we're not saying anything other people haven't said, as you pointed out. If you're going to tell a story like that, you better be really goddamn convinced, right, that your best theory, inflation, string theory, whatever, really strongly suggests, and tails is too strong, but strongly suggests that some sort of multiverse is true.
Right.
And given the failures, string theory has, it's a sort of clever way of recovering GR, not even from a truly quantum basis. Right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that, these people wouldn't say themselves. That's why we have loop quantum gravity and these other alternatives. So, but I'll just come down and say, when physics, this is the point I was trying to make, if physics becomes metaphysics, meaning we just try to tell unifying stories that cover everything, that have no obvious consequences that we can test, I do believe that's a problem for science. I think we really need physics to be distinct from metaphysics in that way. And we should worry if it isn't.
I like that point. I agree with what you're saying, but I wonder why a way it's not distinct is in the mathematical formalism. So, I mean, string theory, the mathematics of string theory is it's amazingly complex, interrelated, elegant. You can't tinker with it without it falling apart. There's not a lot of ways people have tried really hard to come up with something else. They haven't been able to do it. So it's not just metaphysics. It's really, the extension of what's already been going on, which is the mathematization of physics. It's, it's like this. It's like the position that Einstein's theory of relativity was in before they tested it empirically. It was a mathematically beautiful theory, and people didn't think it would be confirmed. In fact, Einstein has that famous quote when they said, how would you have felt if it hadn't been empirically confirmed? He said, I would have felt sorry for God because, the theory's too good or whatever. So that, I mean, isn't that a difference though than just plain metaphysics? The mathematics of string theory is, and I'm not really a fan of loop quantum gravity. I don't think it really works. I'm not an expert, so my opinion doesn't matter. But anyway, that's what I think string theory really is, kind of like the only game in town. In a sense, and it's the mathematics of it are robust and they lead to deeper insights all over the place. So recently there's been a lot of talk about the EPR connection with wormholes, from Malsadana and those guys. So why isn't that a distinctness, or is that not enough? The mathematics behind it.
Well, I don't think string theory I mean, I like loop quantum gravity better, but I think they're both guilty of the same issue, which is, and Ravelli, you know, acknowledges this. These are, to use your contrast case, it's not like relativity because there is no sort of similar confirming evidence. So I think it's all beautiful math. It could be true, of course. It's an empirical question. But here's where the debate comes. Nobody. So far, I haven't said anything that anybody could disagree with reasonably. Right.
Yeah.
Where the debate comes in is, you know, when should you, believe or start to believe in something, or what should you count as science or not science, right? That's where it starts to get hairy. And so for me, I want to say, show me the money, predict something, do something other than just, sort of explain some stuff and show me pretty mathematics. So, none of these theories, right? Take loop quantum gravity. There's very little reason to believe that it can recover space-time or what have you. So we have a whole chapter on quantum gravity, which I can't repeat here, but again, the idea that drives all of these views is that there must be something, in order to unify quantum and relativity, there must be something fundamental to, quantum and something fundamental to space-time.
Right.
And then we get into these weird areas. And we're questioning that assumption in itself.
So you don't think you could have well, I mean, obviously you couldn't have a version of your kind of block world with string theory, not just because of the adynamical, but because of the commitment to strings, right, as a fundamental ontological category. I guess so take, for instance, the search for super partners, which has been going on for a long time.
Right.
People are getting kind of pessimistic. They're not finding these things, and then
right.
people are saying, well, maybe they're at higher energy levels and
supersymmetry.
Yeah, exactly. So and people are saying, well, that's kind of a cop out. You're just going to keep raising the energy levels and so forth and so on. And but there is a kind of a prediction there, and the prediction hasn't been falsified yet. It hasn't been confirmed, but there is the possibility that higher energy levels will find supersymmetry, which would be a kind of confirmation for string theory. So
sure.
So my comparison with relativity was supposed to be like relativity before there was any empirical. I mean, before there was any empirical confirmation of relativity theory, it was still science, wasn't it?
Well, sure. Okay.
It was just mathematics at that point, but there was, and then they did some experiments, and the parallax and that kind of stuff. It confirmed it, but
sure. But as t approaches infinity, right? Everyone has to decide for themselves how close t has to get to infinity before you bail out.
Yeah, right? But it's only been 30 or 40 years. We're not close to infinity.
No, well, no, but I certainly, if you can afford and you think the best use of your money and it's physically possible to build larger super colliders, which is what's going to have to happen, right?
Yeah, they're talking about the circular collider or something lately.
Right. Well, but to test some of the stuff they care about, you're going to need colliders in space.
Yeah.
Look, I would certainly, if I have to choose between spending the money on that or, whatever the current, F-22s or whatever they are, of course, go for it. I mean, I have no objection to trying to confirm these things, right?
Right.
I wouldn't abandon it. I'm just saying, I see no reason, no powerful reason to believe it. And in the relativity case, maybe you could just say it was luck or whatever. We got lots of confirming evidence relatively quickly.
Yeah.
So, and maybe we just need to be more patient, as you suggest. It's certainly possible. I have no I have no a priori reason to rule it out.
If we did have, so this is a big, you know, maybe you don't want to answer this, but if there were some kind of confirmation of string theory, would that falsify your relational block word account?
Not,
would you be skeptical then of your account?
it would depend a lot on what the evidence was. Not necessarily. I mean, because there's nothing incompatible with string theory and block world, right? And string, you know, you and I are talking about string theory in a relatively naive way, but I mean, already nobody really believes in strings. So, you know, we would be talking about, you know, brains exactly. So if they confirmed, for example, I'll just say this to be clear about it. If somehow they came up with confirming evidence for 3D brains in higher spaces, then yeah, that would certainly make me abandon my own view. Because our view is predicated on the idea that you just need Minkowski space-time.
Right.
You don't have to go beyond that. So if it turned out you needed multiple spatial dimensions, yeah, I would be wrong.
Interesting. Okay. Can we talk about dark matter and dark energy, because you give a very interesting account of how you could avoid that sort of stuff in your version of the block world, and specifically the contextual ontological emergence kind of stuff. So can you give us a rundown on how do you get rid of dark matter on your view?
Well, this is I don't know if I can do justice to this in this format without slides, for example, because it's very technical question.
It is technical, yeah. And there's a lot of data that you guys put to use here.
There's a lot of data. So for anybody who's really interested in that, I would refer you to the relevant chapter in the book. But let me just try to start with giving a little background. So, you know, people are winning Nobel Prizes for, you know, predicting dark matter and dark energy or what have you. And the view on the street seems to be that, well, we know that there must be some funky non-baryonic matter or energy, right, that we just can't detect, you know, hence the word dark, right? And what we're saying, the approach that we're taking, and it's not unique to us. There are lots of approaches like this. Is, well, you know, no, you know, it's not like we've made some observation and we know that there is some non-baryonic weirdness, right, that we have to try to figure out. The only thing we know is that general relativity, that Einstein's equations, plus, you know, our calculations about the amount of stuff in the universe, right, can't explain dark matter or dark energy. Okay. So everyone agrees about that. Now the question is, how do you react to that? So one answer, which a lot of people gravitate towards too, obviously, is let's add some new weird shit to the universe. Yeah. Right?
Cool, weird shit.
cool, weird shit. Yeah. And people differ about what the weird shit is, right? I mean, I just saw, you know, I mean, somebody at Oxford just came out with some like, hey, maybe there's like a negative momentum liquid or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's all, but you know, these things come up every day. So I'm not saying it isn't true. I'm just saying, who knows? So, but we also know that there's this other tradition, which is to modify Einstein's equations in some way. So that's another.
That's Mond.
So yeah, so Mond would be an example. And I want to be careful here because a lot of times they don't even really touch Einstein's equations. They just monkey with Newton's equations.
Right.
Because you can just use Newton in a lot of these cases. But it would entail a modification in GR at some point, or Einstein's equations. So what we do is, actually the story is different depending on dark matter or dark energy. But what we do is we use these four-dimensional discretized graphs and say, you know, imagine that the connections between these graphs can be any length that you want. Again, now this becomes very formal. I don't know how to do this without equations and pictures. But the idea, essentially the idea is that mass and general relativity can be a relational property.
Right.
Right. And maybe there's a story to be told about why the relationality of mass is really the explanation for some of this stuff.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, I guess we'll just leave it at that. People really should look at these chapters because they're super interesting, and a lot of work went into into putting this together. That's pretty clear.
Here's the last thing I'll say about it. Anybody who wants to give an account of dark matter or dark energy has to cover all the cases. So often an account just covers one case, but you have to. There's so much data and phenomena that at the end of the day, whoever is right about this is going to be providing a story about all these different cases.
And that's definitely what you guys want to do. Yeah.
We're trying. I'm not saying we did do it. I'm saying that's what we're trying to do. And I think the best thing I can say about this in this venue, again, without slides and equations, is just don't believe the hype, right? I mean, there was a recent talk at the last, Philosophy Science Association meeting on this sort of stuff. And I think they made the point as well. We have no idea what's going on.
Right. Yeah. No, that much is clear. But it's certainly in the popular mind, there's some idea that they really have this worked out. When really, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a total shit show at this point.
It's a total shit show.
Yeah. So that's why I've sort of stayed out of this. It's got to shake out in 50 years or something like that. I don't really even know what the right approach is. So I think your approach is interesting. I wonder if we could switch gears a little bit and start talking about the consciousness part. Allegedly, this is supposed to be a discussion about consciousness. So I figure we should get to it at some point.
Yeah, sure.
So this is a part where I guess I really had some trouble trying to figure out what your views were. Especially with respect to the neutral monism. So I wonder first, before we even start, can you say something about what you take consciousness to be? What is the target explanandum for you?
So the target explanandum for me is subjectivity. And why do I use the word? So, what you and I are experiencing right now. So why do I use the word subjectivity? Because I think the word qualia is loaded.
Yeah.
Right? It's already philosophically loaded. And of course, it's not, people like Dennett have made this point as well, not unique to me. Right. So the idea that there are intrinsic tropes of experience, like seeing red and feeling pain. So when I use the word subjectivity, I mean to reject that. And I mean to say, which obviously is open to debate, that there's no such thing as experience unless it's experience for a subject.
So why would you be comfortable saying then that it's like the Nagel kind of thing, that there's something that it's like for you?
Sure. I just mean to reject the idea that there's any such thing as free-floating qualia apart from experiencers.
Right. Okay.
I don't know what Nagel would say about that. But yes, I'm perfectly happy to say there's a what it's like. Yeah.
Okay. And so then, I mean, the way I think about these is that just phenomenal consciousness then is what you're talking about.
Sure. Happy to. Yeah.
So some people want to resist that. I was just wondering if you were one of those people.
I don't want to resist that.
Okay. So if that's the case, then I really am kind of wondering you talk about this a lot in the book, but I couldn't really figure it out. I mean, I thought I did, and then I thought I didn't. And so I figured I'd just ask you, what's neutral about the neutral base? So I know that generally the idea is that the neutral base is something that having to do with presence, which sounds a lot like consciousness to me. So I'm wondering if you could just first of all say a little bit about the kind of neutral monism that you endorse, and then tell me what's neutral about the fundamental stuff.
Sure. So, this is tricky territory, right? Because whenever we talk about neutral monism or Russellian monism or panpsychism, there are so many different flavors of all that.
Yeah, way too many.
way too many, right? So we have to be super careful. So the neutral monism that I endorse is most closely associated with, for me, in my view, William James, which of course is open to interpretation. Certain periods of Bertrand Russell, who of course adopted every possible view over time.
Yeah, that's one of his virtues.
That's one of his virtues. I agree. And I think the most basic idea of neutral monism, in contrast to, say, panpsychism or Russellian monism, which I take at its most fundamental, is, and there's no intrinsic physical properties, so we need something intrinsic, and that's something like experience or whatever. I take that to be the root idea. Okay, so whatever is basically physical. You could disagree about that. Maybe it's particles, maybe it's the wave function, but whatever it is, right? There's something, there's some, there's some center, that is whatever. Okay, categoricalism or whatever you want to call it. And then dual aspect theory. What does it say? It's, I'm thinking Spinoza, again, open to interpretation, and I'm no Spinoza scholar, but there's something, fundamental, and it has these dual mental and physical aspects, but they are distinct. I think the key idea of neutral monism is there's, whatever's fundamental is neither what we define as matter or mind, as those things are typically, defined, right? It doesn't have the essential properties of matter or mind. But it does have these features, and it turns out that these features are actually identical. They're not distinct, right? That we are wrong in thinking that they are distinct. Okay. So that's what I take to be the core idea of neutral monism. Now, James talks about, and we talk about, and this is your puzzlement, a perfectly reasonable puzzlement, that so what is the neutral? So what is the base, right? And so we say, and James says, that the base is presence. And well, what does that mean? Well, now this gets really hard, right? Because how do I point at this or define this?
Right.
And in the book we try to say stuff like, it's what puts the fire in the equations, or going after Wheeler or Hawking or whatever. And I don't know how to define this except phenomenologically, which already is going to annoy people, right? Who are just annoyed by phenomenological approaches, which I understand. But
I'm not one of them, though, so fire away.
Okay. So, if you've ever been like, in a deep meditative state or tripping or whatever, right? You can get in these states where it seems like there's no object, you're not having thoughts or sensations or whatever, right? But there's something left over. And that something left over is pure presence, right? And even without getting weird like that, if you introspect from moment to moment, right? There is that, we all know that there's this feeling of specialness about the present moment, right? Not, I want to be clear, not what event is present, right? Not like, is this happening now or whatever, because then relativity kicks in.
Right.
That's relative to a reference frame. But this feeling of a now, right? So that's what James and we have in mind by presence. So, and I believe you can subtract all the other contents of experience out, and that still remains. Again, open to argument.
So how is that neutral? Because it sounds like it's a feeling. It sounds like it's phenomenological. It sounds like there's something that it's like to be in that state. So that's the kind of where my puzzlement comes in, because it doesn't sound neutral at all. It sounds mental.
Well, I totally agree that if we had to decide, is it more mental or material, we would all agree, as you say, it's more mental. So how is it not mental? Well, it's not mental in the sense, again, think about these meditative states. It's not mental in the sense that it's not qualia, right? There's no pain, seeing red, etc., right? It's not temporal, right? It's not any of the things that we typically associate with mental. But it is, as you say, something felt, right? Or at least that's how it's experienced.
Right.
But I don't think that we should infer from that therefore it is like a quality. So this is where I differ from some people. They want to say like, oh, that feeling of the specialness of the present, that's just something your brain generates, right? It's just a story your brain tells about the world. But I want to say no, right? That's really what's neutral and fundamental. And if you don't like the idea that it's neutral, I still, we could debate that. I still like the idea that it's fundamental.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, just from my own background, I'm kind of, my views are pretty naive and flat-footed. I kind of an old school identity theorist, so I certainly would say it's something in the brain. But right. I can open-mindedly entertain your position. I know that sort of where you're going with the embodied and activist stuff, and that, and even more generally the Black world. So let's suppose that you're right, that it's not something that the brain produces. It's not qualia as defined by the way you do, something that's intrinsic, something that's a trope. I don't even know what a trope is, to be honest. But anyway, something that something like that. But if we agreed at the beginning of this discussion that by consciousness we mean that there's something that it's like, that's subjective, subjectivity in general, then it certainly seems like it has that property, even though it's fundamental.
I would say it's, but it's a universal, right? So yes, there's something that it's like, but the something that it's like is so stripped down, right? I mean, it's not like listening to the Pogues.
Right.
It's not like being in love. It's not like, you see what I mean?
Right.
I mean,
but it doesn't sound very neutral, though. It just sounds like a very basic kind of phenomenological thing.
What would count as neutral?
Something that was, well, not mental in the sense that we're here. I mean, not involving consciousness in this sense of their being subjective. Because I thought the whole idea was that somehow subjectivity was supposed to be a relational thing, but somehow part of this neutral thing was the material part, and the other part was the subjective part. There's a relation between them. You can't separate it and that sort of thing. But now sounding not like that to me. It sounds like there's a basic subjective part that you can't separate.
Good. So I think we got to be careful about the word subjective here. So for me, the word subjective here means for a subject, right? So so for example, so this is how I would talk about it. So when you're in deep meditation or deep sleep, right? You come out of that, and what happens? Suddenly you're a being in space and time, right? There's a cut there. There's you, and then there's the environment in space and time. And that's the fundamentality of everyday normal, experience. And the whole idea of neutral monism is that cut is a projection, right? It doesn't describe a real distinction, right? It's a projection of the sort. And that drives the whole, hard problem, mind body problem, or whatever. So there's your subjectivity. But I would say that the presence is below it. It's not subjective, right? There is no, in those fundamental presence, right? That is not something, you are not experiencing presence, right? There's not a subject experience presence. There's just presence, right? And it's hard to know how to, people say stuff like pure being or whatever, which annoys analytic philosophers, and I understand why. And I don't have a better language for it.
Right.
But that's the idea.
So I thought you guys said, so maybe this is where the trickiness comes in, because I thought you had said somewhere that you can't have feelings without a subject.
You can't have experience without a subject, yeah.
But this seems like a kind of pure experience with no subject.
Well, it's not, I don't think it's a feeling, though. I think it's what's fundamental.
I thought we agreed just a second ago that it was a kind of feeling, a feeling of
We agreed that it feels like a feeling. That we agree that the way you come out of this, you would describe it as a feeling. But I think it's basic, right?
I mean, yeah, I sort of understand what you're saying, but it just is really hard to see how this isn't a kind of different version of panpsychism, whereby the basic thing is not, it's this, so take, the Russellian monism, which is endorsed by people like Chalmers, who thinks that really, somehow it's going to be like phenomenal red and phenomenal blue, or, pain or something like that, that are the intrinsic properties of matter. It sounds like what you're saying is no, not that, not phenomenal redness, but something else, phenomenal presence. Well,
I would say it's definitely not. So I think, I think the charge that you can reasonably bring is maybe it's idealism of a sort, right? Like in particular, maybe some sort of, like the idealism that, Advaita Vedanta Hinduism espouses or something. I think that might be a reasonable charge. But it's definitely not panpsychism in the sense that, whatever is I take this to be panpsychism. You tell me if you don't like it. Whatever is fundamentally physical has some intrinsic qualia. So I don't think it's that.
Well, you don't have to use the word quality, say some intrinsic phenomenal property.
But I don't think it's a phenomenal, right? I mean, the whole point of neutral monism, first of all, is to deny the very kind of, atomism or division between physical and mental that panpsychism presupposes.
Right.
Right. So it's a total rejection of that.
So you don't want you don't want to say the intrinsic nature of matter is presence. You want to say somehow matter is itself a manifestation of presence.
Right. That's a good way to put it. Yes.
And that's where the idealism, that's why it sounds more like idealism in the way that you're putting it.
Absolutely. I think the very idea of, this is, to go back to your earlier question about space-time source elements and all that, and about, quantum mechanics. I really do think the idea, right, that drives atomism in all its myriad forms, that, the universe is made of some fundamental physical stuff or determined by it, whether it's atoms, fields, waves, whatever, is wrong. And neutral monism is the idea that the very distinction between what we call inner, outer, physical, mental, etc., is an incorrect, a cognitive illusion, a projection.
Yeah.
Right. So if you really absorb all those moves, right, then what you said about presence, I think, is exactly right.
So I guess then you can't ask, on your view, like, what is it? You just have to say it's a neutral, it's like neither mental nor physical.
You can only point to it, I think. You can only say, you know what it is, and try to get somebody to, go through their phenomenological homework or whatever, right?
Yeah. So what's the argument for thinking that, I mean, besides phenomenologically, which, by the way, I think you could account for that in different ways. So I don't think that,
of course, yeah.
If I've had that experience before, and I have, of kind of a contentless, just here's something, but that's compatible with some other kinds of, so that doesn't drive you towards neutral monism. So I'm wondering, what's the argument?
It doesn't entail it, certainly.
Right. So what's the connection? Why believe in neutral monism as opposed to, something else?
Well, I mean, so there's two. You might be asking, why believe in neutral monism as opposed to something else in general? Excuse me. In general,
on this phenomenological datum.
Right. Well, I mean, if we just restrict ourselves to phenomenological datum, I don't know that. I mean, what is there any reason to believe in anything with just that restriction? I don't know. But maybe because it's the most minimal thing that you can say, right? So what is, what do I actually experience? right? If I just restrict myself to that, I experience this pure presence, right? Even minus the contents of experiences. And then, you know, I experience myself as a subject in the world. And that's part of my, part of my concern about panpsychism and Russellian monism is it is totally motivated by some form of physicalism, atomism, materialism, right? So it's like, well, we all know, right? So now we no longer just restrict it to atoms or particles, right? So we have these, holism versions of panpsychism, right? Oh, maybe it's the universal wave function or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's still all motivated by physics first in some way, right? And then I try to tell these stories. Oh, imagine what it would be like if the universal wave function of the universe was conscious. Well, now I have to decompose everybody into their individual consciousness, the opposite of the combination problem, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, now I've got this terrible problem. But what do we actually really know based on everyday experience, right? Like individual embodied beings moving around an environment are conscious. That seems like the key set of properties. And I don't mean that in any reductive embodied, behavioral way, right? More like in a kind of an activist way, right? It seems like the shit that is conscious is shit like us or animals or other animals or whatever. Does that make any
Right.
sense?
No, I'm agreeing. I think that's a good way of putting it, but so I don't know. Don't you get the same kind of problem on your own kind of view? So if what you're saying is true, then don't you have a kind of combination problem? Like where does phenomenal red come from? Where does the experience of pain come from out of this fundamental basis, which doesn't seem like it has any of those properties by stipulation? So you say there's some kind of dividing up of this fundamental stuff into one part the world, the other part the experience. But isn't it kind of mysterious how that happens? What dividing it
I mean,
up means?
in neutral monism, that stuff is basic.
Which stuff?
Stuff like seeing red and feeling pain and what have you, right? So it's, I mean, it's not as basic as presence, but presence is truly neutral. It's not, oh my God, how does this come from presence, right? Because this is some material, non-conscious thing that's fundamental. So I think a good analogy, I hate to use the analogy because it immediately invites idealism instead of neutral monism, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Okay.
Think about your dreams, right? So we know that people who like to push, the idea that, consciousness is just a virtual, brain show, they like to invoke dreams as well.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna try to turn that on its head. Think about your dreams for a second. In your dreams, there's different kinds of dream states, and they can be, your external environment can be weirder, and the nature of the self can be weirder. But whatever your dreams are like, you have this fundamental: I am a being moving around an environment. Your being can shift from third to first person or somebody else. The environment can get really weird and violate the laws of physics, but the basic experience is the same, right? And
Right.
if you have the lucid dream experience, right, you're like, you're looking at it, from some third person perspective, right? And now you're looking at your dream avatar and the dream and all of that from some other perspective. And when you wake up, you might think, oh, well, where did red come from? Or where was that environment? Or where was I? But it's all part of the same thing. So I think that's a good metaphor. It's just, I don't think that it's generated by the brain.
But what is it? So what is it generated by?
It's not generated. I don't think that's where the block world and all that stuff comes in. I think the whole idea that, it's generated is an error.
What a dynamical constraint gives you the experience of pain
Well,
out of the neutral I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I just don't. So I didn't mean to use the word generation because that's a trap given your views.
Right.
I don't want to beg that question, but I mean, so you say the experience of red is basic, but just not as basic as presence. And I guess that's sort of what I'm not understanding at this point. How is that something that's basic?
So it's basic because once you have a subject in space and time, right? Not unlike the way that Kant suggested, only not an imposition of a mind or a brain,
right?
Just the nature of reality. Then, and not unlike a dream state, that's just how it is. Right
Well,
now,
where do you get
you might say why
from?
these experiences. Well, I think the subject comes from, you know, it's a kind of mental error or inductive projection that's prior to a subject.
Say that again.
It comes from thinking, right? So it comes from interpreting experience.
Yeah, see, this is where I'm getting lost. I guess I just don't understand this. How is their thinking? So I thought the view was there's this neutral stuff. I mean, I don't think it's neutral, but I certainly understand the sense in what you mean that it's neutral. But there's this presence. The presence is not a subject. It doesn't involve thinking, right?
I think it involves. It does not involve thinking, but I think it involves. I think the most fundamental cut, right, is this sort of. Here's what the Hindus call it. They call it the witness consciousness.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the idea is that the most fundamental cut is X observing Y, right? But I don't think it's a dynamical process. So again, think about your dreams. Why are your dreams divided up into subject and object?
Am I not supposed to mention parietal cortex and visual cortex?
Well, certainly I don't mean that there aren't, relevant neural things going on. Surely there are. But I don't think those things explain what I'm asking. But the neural, again, right? If you take our view seriously, suppose you think that the brain. So this is just a general question, right? If you take seriously the dynamical view, and you take physicalism or materialism seriously, then somehow the brain generates consciousness. And what that means is that some neural process somehow has to generate conscious experience. That's the generation problem or the hard problem, right? And the sense
I'm not. I mean, I guess I would interrupt you there. Just I want to let you finish, but I don't think the generation problem is the same as the hard problem. They're related, I think, but the hard problem is, as I understand it, just the question of why this brain state gives, is this experience as opposed to some other or none at all. It's not really asking about how it generates it, but just why it is that way. Why is there any experience there at all?
I agree that those are two different questions. So, but I mean, before we could even approach the why this particular one, right, we have to approach the why anyone at all, right?
Right. So I would say you need a theory of consciousness. And if you just look at the brain, you're not going to get it. You need something at the psychological level, which makes sense of all the neural what's going on there. And so there's not going to be a neural theory of consciousness that's asking for it at the wrong level. But I mean, so I don't want to get too bogged down into my own views because I want to talk about your views.
I agree with you about what you just said.
Okay.
So, but then that presupposes that there's something more than just the neural, right?
Yeah, that the neural implements psychological level things.
Right. So yeah. one could add, depending on at what level of abstraction we define the psychological level things, functional, experiential, whatever, we can still ask, well, but how, somehow you get from, A to Z, right? How do you do it? And
I mean, this is something that I thought was, maybe I'll bring it up now because I thought it was interesting. So when you talk about the witness consciousness, I mean, I work a lot on higher order theories of consciousness, and I'm not 100% convinced that they're true, but I'm convinced that they're a contender, that they should be taken seriously. And so I spend a lot of time sort of telling people who dismiss them, hey, don't dismiss these views. And a lot of, there's a commonality, a similarity between the kind of witness consciousness thing that you're talking about.
Because you've created a meta state that's doing the witnessing.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of the thing. So there's a meta state that's doing the witnessing. But so when you talk about the witnessing, that's not the fundamental thing, is it? That's not presence.
No, I would say that it's one step above presence.
Okay, so how do you make that step, I guess, is the question that I'm asking.
Well, the problem with answering the question is, I don't think the answer is dynamical. So I don't know. And of course, you're asking me, so what's the adynamical answer? What's the constraint? But now physics fails me, right?
Right.
So if you ask me about why do you get the results you do in twin slit, I can give you you may not want to sit through it, but I could give you the answer. In this case, I don't know, right? Because you're talking about something beyond physics.
Right. So then that's what I was saying before. Don't you have then therefore a similar kind of problem, a hard problem, a combination problem, some kind of mysterious magic happens, and then there's the thing that gives us consciousness. And isn't that just like every other theory? So
no, I don't think it's the same, because in the case that you're mentioning, you have to assume two things, right? Here's what drives the hard problem, and I would say the generation problem, distinct though they may be. A, that matter is fundamental. B, that matter is essentially non-mental or non-conscious, and C, that matter is essentially defined by its dynamics. So I'm giving all that up. So whatever problem I'm stuck with, it can't be the same as that one.
Right, but you have a version of that still left over, because the neutral is fundamentally non-mental, and so while it's not matter, which is fundamental,
it's neither mental or physical.
Right, so it's not mental.
Right, essentially defined, yeah.
Right, so even though it's not matter, so I agree. So I'm a kind of physicalist, and I agree that I want to say matter is not mental, and then you have to explain how you get consciousness out of that.
Right.
And then you say, well, look, my view doesn't have that problem because I don't think matter. But you still have something which is not mental, and then something mental is the result. So you still have the same gap to bridge. It's just that it's not matter that's doing it. It's this more neutral fundamental thing, but it's the same problem.
I don't think it's the same gap, because when you say, it's not mental, right? It's not essentially qualia or something like that, right? But it's not essentially non-mental. That would be a different claim, right? Again, I would avert to the dream analogy, right? It's more like presence and imagination. And you're going to say, but wait, isn't imagination inherently mental? And I'm going to say, no, it isn't.
Okay.
You only think imagination is inherently mental because you've already divided up the world into physical and mental is where imaginative processes happen. And I think that's exactly what neutral monism denies.
Yeah, but I mean, I understand what you're saying. I take the point, but there still is a gap that you sort of admitted that you can't bridge, given the theory that you have about how you get from the fundamental thing to the witness consciousness, which then is the bridge to regular consciousness. And so there still is this kind of, I don't want to say emergence, obviously, because that's a loaded term, but there's a kind of step in the function here, which seems doesn't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any way you could bridge it, which is fundamentally the hard problem. Why, how could there be consciousness associated with this, with the fundamental stuff?
Well, I think if you take seriously the idea that presence, right, and imagination is fundamental, I don't think it is the same kind of hard problem. The hard problem is really, right, generated by the idea, again, that matter's fundamental, it's essentially non-mental, and it's essentially dynamical. Now, how am I going to get mind out of that, right? That's a unique problem. And what neutral monism does is just deny those, the axioms that lead to the problem.
So the problem that you have, though, you think is less. You admit that there is this still problem, though, right? Before I go on,
I admit there's a question.
Yeah,
but I don't think the answer is dynamical. So it's hard.
I agree that. Yeah.
So it's hard to say It's hard to say something that's going to satisfy your question, right? I don't know what to say. Yes, I admit I don't know what to say to satisfy your question.
So, but you don't think that's as difficult to place to be in as the
because I think the other one is impossible, right? So I mean, this is where I am sympathetic with Dave, right? It's like, it
Chalmers.
matters. Yeah, Dave Chalmers, and his cohorts. If matter's really fundamental, whatever it is, and it's really essentially non-conscious, then yeah, I don't, in my younger days, I used to try to convince myself that some sort of emergence could answer that question. But then, if you take that seriously, there's really no difference between strong emergence and physicalism and materialism and identity theory or whatever, unless you convince yourself, as some people have, that there's some, conceptual account or semantic account, or, if you somehow can convince yourself that, conscious experiences are really not what you think they are or whatever, right? And the higher order thought theory, I think, divides into those two categories. You can tell me if you think that's wrong. You can be more or less realist about consciousness in that venue.
Yeah, I'm a realist in that venue.
Right. So I think if you take it all seriously and you're a realist, and you really believe that what's fundamental is physical and it's not conscious, then however you tell the story, whether it's, meta, observation or whatever, you somehow consciousness really emerges from the physical, right? Somehow, however the story goes.
Yeah, in the same way liquidity does.
Yeah, but of course, that's precisely the point, right? I don't think that's a good analogy. That's the people who are worried about the problem to doubt that that's a good analogy. Because, and again, this is a debate, but in the case of liquidity, right, we feel like we can tell a pretty good story about how you get to liquid.
Yeah, we feel that way because we don't really pay attention to all the details. I mean, still kind of a big mystery about how that works chemically and how that chemical stuff is related to physics.
Well, that would be a long discussion, but it's, about physical chemistry and quantum mechanics. But it doesn't seem like as big of a mystery, right? So, just, go look at a motherboard, go look at pictures of brains or whatever. And imagine you put that in any kind of information theoretic, meta, organization you want. It doesn't seem like it's going to produce what you and I are experiencing.
Well, to me, it does.
Right.
But I agree. That's a contentious point. I understand what you're saying.
Maybe it does, right? It's an empirical question, and don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is, if it does, then here's the fact about the universe. When you take this stuff and you put it in a certain configuration, then it's just a fucking basic law of the universe that now you get conscious experience. That's just fucking strong emergence.
Yeah, but that's not,
not an identity theory.
That's not what happens with water and H2O. I mean, it's not a
Right.
brute fact of the universe.
That's exactly my point. That's why I think these are different cases.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just don't think that it's going to be that kind of brute fact.
But it has to be, right? That's the point of all these. Like, I mean, nobody is less sympathetic to modal metaphysics than I am, like conceivability arguments and all that.
Yeah.
So well, I don't think you have to bring in all that machinery, right? Just as Searle says, look, you know, conscious experience is different. It's subjective, blah, 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 blah. There's a what it's like to be, right?
Yes.
And now you're telling me that brains, neurochemically, you know, sophisticated neurochemically sensitized meat is fundamental. You tell me how you get from one to the other. That just isn't going to be like molecular structure in water. It can't be, right?
I mean, you know, there's a familiar path here. That's what people have always said. I mean, if you went back to Aristotle and you told him that water was H2O, he'd laugh in your face and say, "You're a fucking moron. Water is a basic substance with no parts, duh." And then 2,000 years later, you need a very sophisticated chemical theory to even make sense of the fact that it has parts. And so,
I totally agree that I could be wrong. I'm just telling you why people have the intuition.
No, and that point is taken. No, I agree. I agree.
But what I want to emphasize though is, you know, it's gonna be, you know, like Searle's distinction between whatever, I forget how he uses it, but first or second order emergence, right? This seems like a much more radical kind of emergence than even the liquid case, right? And by the way, even
I agree. If it were that, then that would be hopeless.
Even in the case of liquid, if you really want to explain stuff like liquidity and the hardness of diamonds and whatever, you have to bring in quantum mechanics.
Absolutely.
Which is gonna violate any simplistic atomistic schema.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm on board with that. I mean, if you don't take quantum mechanics seriously in the year 2018, then you know you're doing something else. It's it's not going away. There's no future theory which is going to magically displace it. The only thing that we can hope for is a unification with relativity theory, right. Which can't go away either. They're both right. They've been too confirmed. Old theories, you know, they don't. I mean, even with Newtonian physics, obviously, what we found out is that it's still true around in certain limited conditions. It doesn't get falsified ultimately. It just should get shown that's part of a bigger theory. So I agree with that about quantum mechanics and take seriously that it's going to change, you know, simplistic models of physicalism and stuff like that. So I think that point is well taken, but I guess I'm just more optimistic. That,
why are you so convinced that physicalism is true? And I shouldn't even say physicalism, right? Because I think this is a really important point to make. Physicalism is a metaphysical doctrine, right? That has jack shit to do with science, right? In fact, ontological reductionism with regards to the physical world could be false, and physicalism could still be true.
Yeah.
Right? So there could be some, you know, modal, you know, necessity between the physical and the mental, even though, as most of us already believe, consciousness doesn't reduce to brain states. So science doesn't support that shit. This is an extra scientific claim, right? You agree?
The modal part of it is, yes.
Yeah. So
but I don't think you need the modal part of it to be a physicalist, although I do have that part in my background, but I don't think it's required.
Okay. So I
know perfectly good physicalists who are, you know, ultimate Quinians about modality and say, well, look, you know, it's just physical here and this is the only place, so therefore physicalism.
Okay, good. So let's just stick to the actual world. Why are you so convinced of ontological reductionism?
I mean, I'm not convinced of it, but what I am convinced of is that no one's ever given a good reason not to be convinced.
Well, but that's a burden of proof argument, right?
Yeah.
And we all know that burden of proof arguments can go back and forth.
Exactly.
So you must think that there is, tell me if I'm wrong, you, like others, must believe there's a preponderance of scientific evidence. And that's exactly what I, you know, in the emergent side of me, thinks is not true.
What I
right?
think is that the preponderance of evidence is that consciousness has to be some brain-based thing. I think
Oh, why?
I just think that's, if you're looking for where consciousness is, it has something to do with the brain. Even on your kind of view, I think you have to tell some story about how the brain gets involved. I know,
Sure.
actually, you're embodied an activist guy, so
Right.
the brain is going to be extended and embodied in the environment, and so it's not just the brain. I don't want to burden you with undue things, but
Right.
even so, and I don't know. This is something that I don't really understand greatly because well, I'm an identity theorist at heart. I still don't know why. I mean, so if you just think of the brain as up here in the head, what Dennett calls the neck top, but then I think, yeah, that's at odds with what you're saying. But I mean, as far as I understand, the brain is extends through the body, um, through the nervous system. So when I think of the brain, what I mean is the nervous system, and that certainly is not just in the head. It's the important bits are in the head, but the input to it is all through the body. So,
But why do you believe? I mean, I'll give you whatever definition of the brain you want.
okay.
Why do you believe that consciousness is identical to that?
It's not that I mean,
That's what the identity theory says, right?
yeah, of course, and that's what I tend to. I mean, I have a provisional acceptance of that view, but for me, it's causal considerations mostly that if I want to explain why I do certain things, and I think that consciousness has to be a real causal factor. I don't see that in the other theories. Even in yours, I would be a little bit worried about where the causal factor comes in. But then also, it's just I don't see any reason not to accept it. So modal considerations don't convince me. Multiple realization considerations I don't think are serious.
But there must be positive reasons to accept it, right? I mean,
yeah, I don't have any of those except for causation.
Okay.
So I don't really accept it. What I say is that no one's ever shown a reason not to accept it, so it's not been refuted.
Right.
And
but you don't think there's any strong reason to believe it,
except for causal considerations, I don't. But I think those are pretty strong.
And by that you mean
that the mental has to be causally efficacious in producing behavior.
But now that consideration already presupposes something like causal closure,
right? I don't think it. Well, causal closure of the brain, yes, but I don't think it.
Well, I mean, causal closure of the physical and the biological. I don't think so. Well, the biological, right?
Yeah, the biological, absolutely it does.
And the biological is nothing but physical, right?
Right.
Okay. So
but I mean, that's consistent with I don't know. These issues are so technical, but it's consistent with I mean, some people say laws of thermodynamics suggest that physical closure is not complete, or so is the whole universe a closed system or not? I don't know. Is it an open system? But those questions are hard. But certainly what we can say is that when we're looking at the brain, we've never found any reason to suspect that there are forces coming in or going out that can't be accounted for in terms of neurons firing or
you mean any reasons other than everyday experience? Like,
no,
look,
I mean,
I'm now going to raise my left hand.
No,
or if you don't like that one, how about conversion disorders or placebo effects? Or I think
placebo effects can be explained in terms of neural function. I mean, there's no reason to think that placebo effects suggest that there's forces in the brain which are not action potentials.
Well, I think the word forces is really loaded, dude.
Or energy. I mean, that's what we're talking about is closure.
I don't, I mean, already when you talk about forces, I mean, the idea of forces is going to be radically different depending on which physical, are we talking Newtonian mechanics, quantum field theory? That's already going to be really different. But we're already begging the question about a particular physical idiom, right? So we all every day experience mental causation and control over our own bodies. And we all know from things like conversion disorders that it certainly seems like there are phenomena which are not obviously medically bottom-up explainable, where our conscious, emotional, mental states have profound physiological effects. So when people say there's no evidence, I always wonder what they mean by what would count as evidence.
Well, you would need to show that those kinds of things don't have any neural underpinnings, or that they do, but that they can't be explained in terms of previous cause and effects in the brain.
But what does neural underpinnings mean, right? So let's just suppose it's true that in every case where something mental happens, there's some neural correlate, right? Let's just suppose that's true.
Okay, good.
So to call it underpinnings is already to beg the question, right? Which causes which? Which happens as a result of which? How are those things connected? That's an open question.
I understand the kind of point that you're raising, but so the kind of thing that I'm suggesting is that if you took a simple, I mean, the brain's too complex to do this, but if you took a simple system or a subset of the brain and you saw some activity in a certain area, I'm assuming already that action potentials are important, and that's questionable. And I'm not going to bring up microtubules or any of those things, but anyway, suppose it's action potentials.
Thank you.
So suppose it's action potentials that matter, and then there are some action potentials, and then you say, why did those happen? Well, because the neurons over here gave this kind of input, this kind of inhibitory input, that kind of excitatory input, which caused these action potentials. Okay, so why did those neurons give the input that they did? Oh, because they're connected to these other neurons, and they gave this kind of input. And that kind of tracing back of the causes seems complete. It certainly can be shown to be complete in like simpler animals, like the crab, for instance, and certain kinds of flies. And so maybe that's false in the human brain, but there's no evidence that that's false. That we haven't found anything which says here's some activity in the brain, but lo and behold, there's no input which caused it.
But you see what I'm asking you? So if you're going to invoke, so what you are invoking is causal closure.
Yes, of the brain.
Of the brain, fine.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's got to piggyback on causal closure of the physical, because on your view, biology has to reduce to physics.
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm asking you is,
but we have empirical evidence for that, I think.
Well, okay. So, but what I'm asking you is, tell me what would count as as evidence against your hypothesis. Because if you're going to say, right, if you're going to make the argument based on an empirical considerations, at least tell me what would be evidence against.
Yeah, I just did that. There would be some event in the brain which couldn't be explained in terms of prior causes in the brain.
But that's not, look. But
so there'd be some energy in the system that wasn't a product of previous.
Like some magic protoplasm comes out of nowhere and fills a gap.
No, that there'd be there'd be some neuron firing which its firing rate or couldn't be explained in terms of the input it got from the other that's connected to previous background in the system.
All right, but first of all, as you already said, we can't trace these causes, right? So it's just not true that we have some magical, brain scope that says, oh, we don't have some dynamical equation that predicts all this or whatever.
Well, we have some dynamic. Yeah, the Hodgkin-Huxley equation.
Yeah, but dude, you know how dodgy that is.
Yes, I do. But they're a beginning. I mean, brain science is less than 100 years old.
But even so, that's still just a description, right? Yeah. Unless you're a necessitarian or something.
No, I'm not. Right.
Right. So none of that suggests that there may be no reason why, mental decisions, right, and feelings, which you experience every day, right, affect those dynamics. It doesn't follow that
that's just brain states affecting other brain states.
Yeah, but then you got to tell me a story about how brain states, how conscious states and desires, blah, 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 are nothing but brain states.
I think that's what the higher order thought theory does.
But as you point out in your own work, because I read it, not all higher order thought theories agree about that.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's absolutely true. Right.
Yeah. So if you take the extra burden of trying to make it identical to those brain states, then that's an extra story to be told.
Right.
And I think that's where the added skepticism for many of us comes in, right? I'm not saying you couldn't be right. I'm just saying it's hard for us to imagine how what it's like to be, as you said, could be nothing but the other stuff. In fact, for many of us, it just seems like a category mistake. And that's where it gets weird, right?
Right. No, I understand, and I appreciate the pushback. I mean, I agree, but I guess I just don't find it hard to imagine. I find it kind of easy to imagine that. I mean, I'm against conceivability arguments probably almost as much as you are, but I certainly think that if I were for them, then I think there's a conceivability argument around here, which works in my favor, which is that certainly it's conceivable that there be beings described as I'm describing them, namely that have a kind of biological causal closure with nothing but higher order thoughts, and they'd be conscious just like I am. Not in a kind of stripped down way, but in exactly the same way that I am. You know, I've written about that. I think that's a conceivable thing. The fact that people find it hard to conceive, I don't know what to say about that. I don't find it hard to conceive. I think that's easy to conceive.
Well, this is why I hate these conceivability considerations.
Yeah,
right. Exactly. Like it all turns on what you right.
Exactly. Like, how flexible you are.
Weight to put on any of this.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Well, that's why I think the empirical stuff is more important. So I mean, I agree that we don't have a proof. So I mean, you know, look at the history of causal closure in general. How did they do it? Well, there was a lot of really fucking painstaking work: burning material, collecting the ash, measuring the heat, showing that there's no that the total mass plus heat escaped is the same as the original mass. That was really backbreaking work that took a long time.
Sure.
And we haven't done that sort of thing with respect to the brain. So we haven't done those kinds of experiments which would conclusively show that this is a closed system. But what we have so far is no reason to suggest that it's an open system. Certainly we have in smaller systems that we understand fairly well, there's no evidence for that. Now, they don't have the same kind of mental states we do, so there's a problem there. But as you're building up more and more complex brains, we haven't found a gap yet where strange energies show up that aren't in the system already. And you certainly would expect that. I mean, if what you're saying it were correct, then I would predict that if someone's emotional state was somehow acting on the brain, and if that wasn't just another brain state acting on the brain, then you would see some energy. You would see some action potentials where there shouldn't be. By which I mean they weren't caused by previous neurons connecting to that neuron. We haven't found anything like that. I mean, that it's an open possibility. I don't, you know, I guess I sort of can say, yeah, but why would we expect that given what we know about how the brain works right now? It doesn't, I mean, I don't think anyone.
Everything about our everyday experience and everything we know about things like conversion disorders and psychosomatic effects suggests, and our everyday experience suggests that mental phenomena does constrain neural phenomena.
Right.
And you say, yeah, so what? Because it just is that.
Yeah.
And then I say, yeah, well, what does that mean? Right. And that's where it gets troubling. Right. You know, to go back to the idiom of people like Chalmers, the question is, well, why does there have to be, you know, if that's the way the world is, why is there any phenomenology at all? Why is there any what it's like to be at all? Right. And because it's all just a closed neurological story. And you say, oh, because of higher order thought theory.
Or some other nice theory. But yes, I would kind of vote for that one.
But
I mean, I wouldn't rule out
something new. There's a difference between a world where there are zombies and not zombies, right? Do you agree with that?
Well, I think zombie worlds are logically impossible, but I mean,
well, that's fine. But you agree there's a difference between zombie worlds and non-zombie worlds, right?
If there were zombie worlds, then yes, there'd be a difference.
Okay. But
yeah, but I think so, because the reason why I say it that way is because a true zombie world would have some physical difference. There can't be a duplicate of our world, which is a zombie world. That's impossible. There's no way that could happen.
But
you could have a world without consciousness that was physically different than.
But imagine it's radically like. I mean, we already know that. You know, we already know from humans and non-human animal studies and everything else that radically different neurophysiologies can have phenomenology associated with them.
Yes.
So, It's not about a physical difference. Make it the physics or the biology as different as you want, right? There's still a difference between worlds with phenomenology and worlds without.
Yes.
Okay. And that requires an explanation. And I think that's exactly what people worry, mere biology cannot provide.
I agree. It's not going to be mere biology. It's going to be psychology which provides it. I mean, so that's my view, but like I wouldn't rule out a view like Ned Block's, that it's just a brute identity. I think that's a weird view to have given other background considerations, but it's perfectly consistent view. There's nothing logically wrong with it. And so I have like a
I think there is some, I don't know exactly what Ned means, but if he means that the subjective, the third person, the what it's like can be nothing but the first person can be nothing but the third person, then no, I don't. I think that's logically ruled out.
By what?
By the fact that it's a category mistake, right?
What's that mean? So one subjective, that's the category mistake part?
Again, you can have a world with nothing but physics and chemistry, right? And no conscious experience.
Yeah, there'd be no brains.
And you could have a world, you could have
a world with brains like ours and no conscious experience.
But let's suppose that's true, right? That still doesn't entail that conscious experience is nothing but brain states.
No, it doesn't.
All that entails is this is a world where here's a crazy law, right? When you get these brain states, bam, you get these conscious states. In other words, that kind of materialism is absolutely no different from the kind of stuff O'Connor is selling.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
that's really my point. That kind of physicalism is absolutely equivalent to the kind of radical emergence that people like Tim O'Connor are selling. And I'm skeptical about both.
Yeah. So
you're either a limitivist about consciousness or you're not. If you're not, then you got to take my consideration seriously.
I certainly take it seriously. I am not an illimitivist or even an illusionist, really, to be honest with you, about conscious experience. And I take these considerations seriously, but I don't know why they force me out of my view. So I
don't, it depends on what your view is. I think they force you out of an identity theory, right?
I don't see that.
Because consciousness, subjectivity, what it's like to be, is by definition not just, the behavior of molecules.
I don't see that. I guess it could be just the behavior of molecules.
It couldn't. It could be. There could be a law of nature that says whenever you have this behavior of molecules, you get a what it's like to be like this. The world could be like that.
That's the radical emergence thing.
Yes.
Yes.
But the idea that there's some alternative to that view that isn't a limitativist is just illusion. There isn't. Right?
I don't see what the illusion is. So if you have a theory of consciousness, so for I think where we were agreeing, or so just go back to some stuff we were talking about earlier. We were agreeing, I thought, that consciousness involves subjectivity. It involves there being something that is like for me, from my point of view, etc. And so that's why I like higher order theories of consciousness generally, because I think they capture that part of it. So that's kind of almost a conceptual claim about what consciousness is, that it involves this kind of thing from my point of view, for me. And so higher order theories want to capitalize on that in some sense and say, well, having something be that way for you is you being aware of it. So being aware of something, you can give a non-consciousness involving account.
Well, look, when you bring in being aware, you've already slipped in the ghost, right?
Yes, yeah.
the universe and not like what something one of us was saying.
It's probably me. But I don't think any ghost has been slipped in, because being aware is just representation. It's just
but it can't
being informationally responsive.
Look, I mean, look, I can give you a more complicated version of this objection, but we can write, we can make hardware and write computer programs where one state is quote unquote monitoring another all day long. Nobody expects any conscious experience out of that.
Some people do, but I don't. You're right.
Well, okay, you don't, right? Yeah. Only like some wacky kind of panpsychist or whatever expects that.
No, I don't think so. I think functionalists expect that.
Well, okay, fine. Functionalists of a very, yeah, okay.
If you're a higher order theorist than a functionalist, then they think you.
But we can instantiate these things, and there's no evidence that they're conscious.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
My view is that what a thought is something that's biological. That's the identity part. So that you can't, if it's not biological, then you're not going to have the right kind of thought there.
But we got to be really careful here, because when we say that conscious processes are identical with brain processes, right, that could mean a lot of things. There's a sense in which I might even assent to that, right? But if it means that conscious processes are literally nothing but, right, nothing over and above neurochemistry evolving over time, almost all of us would disagree with that, right? And that's the strong version you need to just make this go away.
Why would we disagree with that? I'm not sure what the...
Because...
What else is there?
Because neurochemical processes all over the world proceed apace without any what it's like to be connected with them. And even when there is a what it's like to be connected with them, it's distinct from the neurochemistry itself.
I mean, that's a little bit like saying there are physical processes which aren't water, so why think that, atoms or quarks make up water? They're arranged in the right way and so forth, interacting in the right way. Yeah.
But that's exactly what all of these people who are concerned about the hard problem and the generation problem are pointing to. This seems like a leap and a difference far greater than water versus not water.
Yeah, that's the part I don't get. I don't see what the big leap is. But
you must, even if you don't agree with it, you must see why people feel like it's different.
I think that people who have a bad theory about consciousness think that is different.
But it's not just bad, right? I mean, it's kind of built into everyday experience, right?
Well, that's the part I don't really see.
Okay.
So if you build in the qualia stuff, intrinsic, ineffable, private, etc., then yeah, you're going to have these sorts of problems. None of those are really properties of consciousness. I think we agree on that.
You think matter is fundamental, and you think it's inherently non-conscious, right? Whatever it is, strings, you pick your poison, right?
Yes.
And then it evolves in certain ways, and certain structures form as a result of its behavior, like brains. And then certain brain states are monitoring certain other brain states. And then, bam, there's a what it's like to be.
Yes, but it's not really like bam.
The story? But what is it? I mean,
it's not. There's no bam. It's not the Emerald Lagasse theory of consciousness. But there is there is the being aware of the other brain states is what consciousness is. I would say yes. If it's something physical, that's the way I would want to go. But it's not mysterious. It's because that's sort of conceptually what consciousness is. It's being aware. I mean, consciousness involves this kind of subjectivity, but it kind of awareness.
It isn't that. Consciousness is just not one physical state monitoring another. We can do that all day long, and there's no consciousness. It's what it's like to be. It's subjectivity. It's all that stuff that you talked about. Whole, right? I mean, as Chalmers would say, you can imagine that a brain does everything that it does without the phenomenology, right?
But that's false.
But if it's false, that's fine. But if it's false because there's just this weird law of nature that says whenever you get X, you get Y. And
I think it's false because you start with a bad concept of what consciousness is.
But it's what you're experiencing right now.
Right.
I'm just pointing to it. Right. Yeah. So we don't even. So we agree. We're not disagreeing about what the phenomena is we're talking about.
No, we're not. Not at this point. No,
and so, so the argument I'm trying to press here is simply that this brand of identity theory is really not distinct from, that strong kind of emergence. We're just differing about which features, make it happen.
Yeah, but it's not any stronger than the emergence of water from H2O or liquidity from H2O.
I agree.
So
people disagree about that.
Yeah, and that's reasonable to disagree with. But I don't think it's a strong kind of emergence. I think that what makes it seem like a strong kind of emergence is that you're building more into the ordinary conception of consciousness than the things we've talked about. You have to build in more to it, like that it's simple.
No, you don't have
to. The essence of it.
No essence. You just have to point to it. We all know that the world is full of chemical, neurochemical, biological processes for which there's no attending what it's like to be.
Yes, I agree.
And then there are some for which it is.
Right.
Why?
Well, that's what you need a theory for.
And so your theory is, the reason that there are some that have it is because there are some physical states that look in on others.
Yes.
But we can write that software. We can build that hardware, right? And by the way, even in biology, right? Even in a single cell, there are going to be states that are monitoring other states. Do you believe cells are conscious?
I don't know, but they're not. So they're not monitoring. So monitoring maybe is the bad word. There's a kind of an awareness of the states, which attributes them to yourself.
Awareness here better not mean anything phenomenological, right? No. Or you're already sneaking it in.
It's right. It's an awareness which attributes the states to oneself. So you say
oneself. Well, I mean that can't be right. I mean you're not giving yourself a self, right?
At the psychological, yeah. So when you have the higher order state, roughly what it does is say, I am in state X, like I am seeing red, or I am experiencing blue, or something like that. So
but you can't mean that phenomenologically, right? There has to be a case where, given physicalism, materialism, at time t, there's no conscious experience. And then now there's an organization, functional, whatever you want to call it, of a certain sort. And then at time t+1, now there's a conscious state.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
But before that
time t+1 is when you become aware of yourself as having the first order states. That's what consciousness is.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's phenomenological at that point, because that's what phenomenology is.
But you don't find this amazing? I mean,
I don't find it any more amazing than liquid. Water. Yeah, exactly. I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's no more amazing than relativity theory. I mean, that's pretty amazing, but it's science. So
except none of those physical things, however weird you want to get, entail what it's like.
They don't, right? Because
I don't think that's a kind of an amazing new thing.
But they're not theories of that. So they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be theories of, whether people agree that something happened at the same time, or how to calculate something's position at another point in time. But so this is a theory of how phenomenology happens. So it's not amazing that the
logic of the hard problem is so horrendous, because it's like, for any story you tell, they're going to say, but why does phenomenology emerge under those conditions? And at the end of the day,
yes, I know, I've heard them say that.
Right. And so at the end of the day, the only thing that you can say is, look, I'm sorry, but that's just how it is, which is equivalent to saying exactly what the emergentist says. It's just the way it is.
It's not, though.
It's like the IIT account, right? They're going to say that when phi is high, there's conscious experience. Boom. Yes. End of story. Right?
They do say that.
Yeah. So that's different from your account, but it's a similar kind of idea, right? In the sense that, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right? Like for you, it's going to be some sort of particular higher order thing. For them, it's phi.
Right.
And I'm just saying, you're both stuck with this. Hey, when this obtains, boom, you get a what it's like to be. That's just the way the world is. And that's all you can say.
I mean, that's not all we say about liquidity. So if you don't understand a lot of chemistry, then that's all that you can say. But if you do have some chemistry, then you can tell a different story. So if you have a theory, and the IIT people think they're doing the same thing. I mean, they, I don't want to defend them too much, but they started
to invoke liquidity as well.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of physicalists do, I think. Because, well, they're not even really physicalists, actually, I would say.
No, they're not. I agree.
Yeah. But anyway, so.
But I don't think hot theory is necessarily physicalism either.
As it's usually defended, it's a kind of functionalism.
I know they want, but that's not physicalism.
I agree. It's not.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree.
All right.
But my version of it is a physicalist version, because what I think is that what hot theory allows us to do is to pick out the relevant brain states, and then that's what they are. In the same way that a description of what lit water is allows us to pick out H2O, and then we find out water is H2O. But we use a description to single it out, or if you don't like the word description, we use a function to identify what it is. That's what I think hot theory really does for us, is allow us to identify the things in the brain that are the relevant states. That's not standard interpretation of it. That's my own view. But anyway, so I agree with you about functionalism. I don't think functionalism is physicalism, precisely because it doesn't have this metaphysical commitment to it having to be that way. So that's not physicalism. But anyway, so if you have a theory, then you can say more than it's magic. You can't just say it emerges, it just happens. You can say, well, look, this is what consciousness is. This is the thing that does that is that. So that's what consciousness is. I mean, it's a kind of standard, I know you don't like reduction, but it's a kind of standard reductive move, what you find everywhere else. There's no difference except for that. And you certainly couldn't do that with water and H2O without theories on either end. You need a theory of chemistry, but you also need some way of identifying water as well. And so what hot theory allows us to do, in the way I think of it, is allows us to identify which thing it is we're interested in. And then we look in the brain and say, what does that?
But hot theory necessarily has to be a kind of functionalism, because it doesn't have to just be brains, right? The whole idea has to be that if you have even something instantiated in another medium, if it has the right, you pick the word you want, you don't like monitoring, right? Whatever structure, then you're going to get conscious experience.
I mean, I would deny that.
You think it has to be brains?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But now that's not the way that normal people interpret it. I mean, what you just said is the way that it usually is interpreted. Right. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Okay. Okay. Well, then you can tell a story about why you think it has to be brains or something biological or whatever.
I mean, the same is true with water. If we build some synthetic H2O, we're not going to say it's water, therefore, just because.
Well, I mean, you might call it something different, but that's a different. You might call it something different, but right. I mean, there's nothing about higher order thought theory that all I'm saying is necessarily entails a particular biological medium. That's all I'm saying.
That's true.
You agree with that?
Yes, I do. You have to add some extra machinery to it to get to just you have to have a particular philosophy of science, basically, to get to just the biological stuff. Right. But people who like hot theory are generally open to machine consciousness.
My point.
I'm currently writing a paper with Ledoux, Joe Ledoux, and Haquan Lau, and I know Haquan is defends that the idea that machines could be conscious based on hot theory.
Right.
I'm skeptical of that, but I think that's an empirical claim. I just don't think we're gonna ever get to a kind of AI that's conscious.
Yeah, I'm with you. You and I agree about that.
Yeah. For probably maybe different reasons, but I mean, I certainly, all the things you're saying, I agree with. Those are issues. I'm not trying to say.
Well, let me
just let me dismiss all those issues. But
no.
Let me think they're decisive.
Let me just step back and say the reason that I went on the offense, right, is not because I think what you believe is crazy or obviously wrong, because who knows? Nobody knows at this point. It's because I'm just trying to show you why people take these different kinds of approaches.
Oh, no, I understand
because
that.
They're so skeptical of you know, identity theory, physicalism, whatever.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with that. That's why I like talking with people like you who have developed these or helped develop these sort of radical alternatives, because I'm open to being convinced.
I mean, you could believe in neutral monism even if you believe none of the other crazy shit we say.
Yeah.
But I really am sympathetic to neutral monism in the sense that my gut reaction is the hard problem, the generation problem, and I think even your view would agree with this, has to be based on some misconception. Like we've made some fucked up assumption that we need to go back and fix.
Yeah, yeah, we agree on that. Yeah, absolutely.
And so for me, the fucked up assumption is that matter is fundamental and it's non-conscious. Because for me, once you go that far, then you're stuck with all these terrible alternatives, right?
Yeah. No, I'm getting that feeling. I don't think they're that terrible. And really, I mean, but I understand what you're saying. And certainly I'm open to exploring those other issues as well, those other options, which is why, I like having these sorts of discussions, specifically to challenge my own views, but also to sort of expand my mind, to see why people passionately push these other lines. So I appreciate everything you're saying. And it's not that I certainly don't think what you're saying is crazy or obviously false. So I hope that didn't come across.
I don't think what you're saying is crazy or obviously false either.
Then we agree.
I mean, I really am like, I take my job as for me, my job is to take a point of view that other people don't take and just try it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a dog. If everything I believe is false, I would not be shocked, right? I'm just trying to take a different angle. Which I think a lot of people, that's my big complaint about the community is like, you don't have to be like an ideologue about what you're pushing, right? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm with you on that. I mean, a lot of the reason I defend the higher order theories for exactly same thing.
Yeah.
It's a point of view. It should be taken seriously. People dismiss it, so I try to defend it. I think that's sort of what you're saying is that if we spent more time trying to defend these other views rather than just dismiss them in one line, we would see there's a lot of virtues that these other approaches have, which are often overlooked.
I totally agree. I mean, I think our job, we don't have enough empirical constraints on this problem yet. Hopefully we'll get more. That's why I like the science first approach. At least you get some empirical constraints, however underdetermined. And we don't have enough. So we all just have to be imaginative and try out different shit.
Yeah.
And hopefully the future will say, it'll tell us who was right and wrong.
Exactly.
Right? That's my hope.
I agree 100%. And I really appreciate that perspective too, and the thoughtful comments. I'm noticing the kids are waking up downstairs, and we've been talking for 2.5 hours, so I don't want to keep you forever. But I do wonder if there's anything that hasn't come up yet that you want to talk about before we sort of end. Anything we haven't discussed?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay, yeah, I think so too. I want to thank you, Michael.
I can't imagine a viewer who would watch the whole conversation we just had.
Well, I can imagine them, but yeah, you're right. But I eventually will chop these up into smaller pieces and
all right, cool,
or whatever, in the limit that will happen. but I want to thank you, Michael, for having this discussion with me. It's been really a lot of fun for me, and I learned a tremendous amount by reading your book and interacting with your work. We still haven't even got to the whole inactive thing and how that connects to your view. So there's still so much more interesting stuff that you're working on. It's too bad that we can't get to it, but I do really want to thank you for being with me. Yeah, show that again, because it was on me.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you. I really enjoyed this. For me, you know why I love philosophy? Just to have conversations. So for me, this is the essence of why I do this. So thank you for having me.
Cool. Thank you. I agree that this is why we're here. So thanks again. And I hope I'll see you around, and maybe we'll talk to you again at some point later.
Okay. Peace.
Okay. Peace.